I am Lindley Stowe. I'm a college success coach with Conexion Americas, and I'm going to be taking us through the third part of this three-part series in which we tie everything together, everything we've learned about immigration and the Latinx community, and connecting that to the college-going process and how to best support these students as they navigate that. Conexion Americas is a Nashville-based nonprofit. Our mission is to build a welcoming community and create opportunities where Latinx families can belong, contribute, and succeed. And we do that through offering various services. We have an education team, an economic team, a community and civic engagement team to try and meet as many needs as the immigrant community in Nashville has presented. Part 3, we're going to talk about college access for specifically a lot of information for DACA and undocumented students. Today's agenda includes a quick snapshot of Latinx students in Tennessee, specifically again, DACA and undocumented students, the landscape of higher education in Tennessee, and the college-going process for this student population, specifically in Tennessee. Now, nationally, all students who have DACA or who are undocumented will not receive a Pell Grant. They are not Pell eligible. But regarding state aid and state policies, that changes from state to state. So most of the information we talk about today is specific to Tennessee. So if you have questions about other states, if you're working with somebody from another state, they would need to research their own state's policies regarding DACA and undocumented students. This information is from about 2017. For obvious reasons, it's very difficult to track specifically the undocumented numbers in Tennessee, especially those who are in school. But as of 2017, there were about 18,000 undocumented students in Tennessee. So obviously beyond the student population, there are more. Those statistics are a little more available more recently, but students specifically 18,000 and about 110 in a public school, in a public post-secondary institution like UT or MTSU. DACA and undocumented students are also, in addition to not being eligible for the Pell Grant, in Tennessee, they are not eligible for Tennessee Hope or Tennessee Promise, so no state financial aid. They're also paying out-of-state tuition at state schools. A survey in 2017 showed that about 72% of Tennesseans were in favor of offering undocumented students in-state tuition. If you would like more general and updated information on DACA and undocumented people living in Tennessee, a really fantastic resource is the Higher Ed Immigration Portal. So you're welcome to pause the video here if you're in a group and you would like to take time to discuss these questions, but feel free to just move right along just to get our brains churning a little bit, some questions to get us started. So what parts of the application process are probably the same for undocumented students? And which ones might be different? Which portions might be different? And what are some questions that you have about this process? Hopefully we'll answer all of them, but if not, I'll certainly be sharing my information in case there's anything else I can help with. So a lot of the components are going to be the same for DACA and undocumented students. During senior year, they're going to be submitting applications to schools, to scholarships. They're going to be writing their personal essays and looking for letters of recommendation from teachers and counselors, et cetera. It is very important that these students start early. We say that for, I think, all students. We start the conversation maybe freshman year, but definitely around junior year when we're starting to take the ACT. For these students especially, it's essential to start early. They need to have a list of schools. They need to start knowing which schools are kind of DACA and undocumented friendly, as well as which scholarships they'll be eligible for. So those will be scholarships that do not have a requirement of residency or citizenship for eligibility. A lot of the scholarships that these students will qualify for have very early deadlines. We're going to talk about a couple that have deadlines, for example, mid to late September of the student's senior year. So these students really need to start their senior year ready to hit the ground running. Prior communications with their families is also essential. And we've talked a little bit during the cultural piece of this series about families are very close, families are very involved, and these families may have some sensitive situations, some anxieties or concerns about post-secondary. It's also possible, we say this to everybody, and for these students, it's just as important. Be filing your taxes correctly, have them ready, have all of the documents that you do have, please have them ready. And if you don't have them ready, start gathering them ASAP, right? So again, please feel free to pause if you want to take a minute with a group to raise your hand, see who thinks it's truth, see who thinks it's false. I'll do a slight pause, but not a long one as I go through some of these questions. So true or false? Private universities tend to be more affordable for DACA and undocumented students. So this is true. Private universities tend to have much higher tuition, but because DACA and undocumented students are paying out-of-state tuition, schools like MTSU, UT, TSU, their out-of-state tuition is quite high, and we're going to look at some examples in just a moment. But because those students are looking at out-of-state tuition versus private school tuition, those two amounts are much more comparable. The difference is that private universities offer significantly more financial aid to these students. Because TCAT does not have in-state and out-of-state tuition, it is a great option for DACA and undocumented students. So this one is a bit of a trick question. So DACA students have a social security number, but that social security number is for a work permit. So that's why it doesn't give them access to the FAFSA. It doesn't give them access to federal aid or state aid, but it gives them permission to work. So TCAT, many of their programs at the end require sitting a state board, getting a state certification or license in order to complete the program to begin work. So like cosmetology, for example, you have to get your state license. DACA students with their social security number can sit a state board, can get a state certification. Undocumented students cannot. So it's very important to do research if an undocumented student is looking at a TCAT option to look and see if that career is going to require a state certification. Because if that's the case, it may not be the best option for those students. Students who have a social security number through DACA should submit a FAFSA. So we at Conexion Americas do not encourage our DACA students to submit a FAFSA. It won't put them at risk for anything, but it also won't process. They're going to receive an error message every time they try to submit because their social security number does not qualify them for the FAFSA. So the bottom line is it's honestly just kind of a waste of time and effort because it's never going to be accepted. Their FAFSA will never process correctly. Parents of Pell eligible students. So Pell eligible meaning that they have permanent residency or are citizens. Parents of Pell eligible students who do not have a social security number should use their I-10 on the parent portion of the FAFSA. So this one is false. We have a lot of students who were born in the US to undocumented parents. And most of those parents, they're filing their taxes, so they have an I-10, but on the FAFSA, it will not accept an I-10. They need to put all zeros. Pretty simple, just put all zeros. They won't be able to use the IRS data retrieval tool as they complete the FAFSA, but you just put in all their information manually and all zeros for the social, and then the rest of it goes pretty much like everybody else's. So just a quick glance at the landscape of higher education in Tennessee. Really, this is the case for pretty much every state, but just to remind ourselves of what type of institutions we're looking at, and then relating that to how that relates to DACA and undocumented students, the options that are available to them versus the options that are actually best for them. So public schools, we're in Nashville. Community colleges, the most popular one is Nashville State, Ball State, Columbia State, Motlow State. 2-year institutions. TCAT, again, anywhere from programs that last a few months to up to about 2 years, around about 4 to 10K per program. Again, there's no in-state and out-of-state tuition, so this can be a good option, especially for DACA students. Locally governed institutions like Austin P and MTSU, Tennessee State, Tennessee Tech, and then UT, of course. So these are all public schools, all state schools. So except for TCAT, they all have in-state and out-of-state tuition. So this is again from a report published by Turk from about 2016 or 17. So tuition goes up every single year. So these tuition rates are no longer current, but it gives us a good idea of the comparison. So what our DACA and undocumented students are looking at paying to go to public schools. So I'm in Nashville again. So the most common choice among my students who go to a public school in Nashville is MTSU, because they usually live at home while they go to college. So for a resident of Tennessee or a citizen, they're looking at about $6,500. It's more now, but back then they're looking at $6,500. Whereas an out-of-state student would be paying $23,600. So it's a really big difference. And that out-of-state amount is really comparable to like Cumberland and Trevecca, a couple of the private schools nearby. So private schools, again, often offer more funding options for DACA and undocumented students, even if the tuition is higher. Usually at the end of the day, almost always at the end of the day, the student will end up paying less because they're receiving more financial aid. So looking at Vanderbilt, Cumberland, Lipscomb, Trevecca, Belmont, all in Middle Tennessee, Christian Brothers in Memphis, I believe Maryville College in East Tennessee. And there are many out-of-state options. In our experience, most of our students do stay local for college. So we're not going to spend a lot of time today talking about out-of-state options. If you do have a family and a student who is open to that, there are other states that even though the student would be coming from Tennessee, no matter what, they'd be paying out-of-state tuition, there can be even more financial aid offered to students at state schools or private schools in other states that have friendlier policies towards DACA and undocumented students. For-profit institutions, we've very much had a mixed experience with these institutions. Personally, we have had at Conexion Americas, we've had more negative than positive. This is a really important opportunity to teach students about doing their homework, doing their research, making sure that if there's one program that's really attracting them to a specific for-profit institution, making sure that it is fully accredited, making sure it's going to have all the resources that they need, make sure that they're paying a lot of attention to the financials. At the end of the day, it's always the student's choice. Our job is to make sure they have all of the correct information to empower them to make the best choice for themselves. In our experience, usually that's not a for-profit institution, but I think they just merit a lot more research than any regular, whether public or private institution. So talking more about the FAFSA for DACA and undocumented students. So again, DACA recipients have that social security number. It's not going to make them eligible for a FAFSA or for any of the Tennessee state aid programs. They can submit a FAFSA and there's no risk involved in that. They'll just keep receiving an error message. So that can be time consuming, that can be frustrating. It's really unnecessary for them to do so because it's just not going to work. But it's important to note that there's no risk involved with DACA students, but there is a risk involved with undocumented students because they're putting all of their personal information on a document that they submit to a federal database. So there is a risk that an undocumented student would be identified if they tried to submit a FAFSA. So we strongly discourage those students from trying to submit a FAFSA online. And when you have a question about what to send to school. Schools have individual policies on what they will accept in place of the FAFSA. In most cases, in my experience, we've been able to just submit a copy of the parents' tax transcripts from whatever year the tax documents are for that FAFSA year. So that right now we're preparing for the 22-23 school year. So we're using the 2020 taxes. So we're also submitting 2020 tax transcripts in place of the FAFSA for the upcoming school year. We strongly discourage both our undocumented and documented students from filing the FAFSA. This can be a great opportunity if a student is feeling vulnerable or insecure about calling a college to say, hey, I'm undocumented, I can't submit a FAFSA, so what can I submit to you? Call on their behalf, let them remain anonymous, and get the information for them. Some schools can accept a paper copy of the FAFSA. In most cases I've worked with, we can submit tax documents in place, and some will accept a CSS profile in place of the FAFSA. A lot of schools, a lot of high schools have those FAFSA nights or FAFSA events that are required. So one thing Conexion Americas offers is a FAFSA alternative information session for those students. So you can talk to your district, your principal, counselor, somebody to see what options you can make available to students who can't submit a FAFSA, but are still expected to go to this FAFSA event in which they may feel really exposed or excluded and uncomfortable. And again, end of the day, students get to make their own choice. So if a DACA student really wants to submit a FAFSA, that's their choice. We just try to get them all the correct information. So DACA and undocumented students paying for college, obviously this is a big concern, a big barrier. They still qualify for merit-based scholarships. So if they have the GPA and the ACT to get a merit-based scholarship, they're still good to go. Looking through, there are several scholarships that do not require citizenship or residency to be eligible, and we'll go over some. I'll share some of those resources, some lists of scholarships. Payment plans can make it more manageable for a lot of students if they're paying installments monthly rather than all at one time at the beginning of the semester, and then part-time options. The CSS profile, which many of you may be familiar with, maybe not, it is an alternative to the FAFSA. So it's the same idea of an application that collects the family's financial information in order for a school to determine what kind of financial aid that student needs, but it's run by the College Board. So it's a private database. It's not going to the government. It's only being shared with the schools you choose to share it with. So it's guarded information that students can complete. And some institutions require it instead of the FAFSA, like Vanderbilt and Sewanee. Really important information for the parents. And this is across the board, I know, but especially, parents who are undocumented may feel more vulnerable about filing taxes, but it's absolutely, without a doubt, in their best interest, the parents, as well as their entire family, their students, for them to file their taxes and to file their taxes correctly. They should use all of the correct information. Even if they don't have legal status in Tennessee, they should use their address in Tennessee, all of that information correctly. Because every school, even if a student is not submitting a FAFSA, every school is going to ask for financial documentation. And the only difference is, again, for the parents who don't have a social security number, where the FAFSA asks for their social, they just put all zeros. Some other challenges you may face, sometimes there's just transparency about schools' policies, about scholarship eligibility. And this is just a great opportunity for us to support and advocate for our students and help them research, empower them, and speak to schools, reach out and see what the options are for them. Again, lack of their own or their parents' tax verification, just encouraging them to file their taxes every year, do all of it correctly. And if that's a resource that parents are not sure where to go to file their taxes, whom to trust in that process. At Conexion Americas, we have some limited tax appointments, but we also have many connections that we can refer families to of certified CPAs who are trustworthy, who are bilingual, and who can help them with that, even if it's been years or they've never filed taxes. And of course, a lot of these students feel hesitant to disclose any sensitive information. So creating a safe space for them, letting them know that you're their ally and that you will keep their information, creating that relationship with them of safety and trust is really important. So these are some of those scholarships we were talking about that can be great options for DACA and undocumented students. So these are obviously for high achieving students. They are quite competitive, again, have very early deadlines in September of a student's senior year. I know that Questbridge and Golden Door also, they partner with specific universities. So the student both has to be accepted to the university as well as get the scholarship, and then they'll be matched with the university, and those scholarships will cover full tuition. But it almost certainly would involve the student going out of state. Most of their universities, almost all of their universities are outside of Tennessee. So this would be, again, a high achieving student who is open to the idea of leaving home to go to college. But if that's the case, these are wonderful opportunities for students. These are some local scholarships. ECE, Equal Chance for Education, has been the best resource for our students. They also, similar to Golden Door and Questbridge, they have partnerships with specific universities. So here in Middle Tennessee, they partner with Trevecca, Lipscomb, and Cumberland. And I know that they also partner with Christian Brothers and I believe Maryville College as well in East Tennessee, but their website has the full list of schools they partner with. It doesn't cover full tuition. As you can see, it's up to $25,000. So that covers a lot of the tuition at schools like Cumberland and Trevecca. At Lipscomb, it still leaves a chunk of change for students to still have to cover, but they can stack it with merit-based scholarships. The Community Foundation has one quite long application on their website, but it's one application for many, many scholarships. And some of those scholarships do have residency and citizenship as a requirement, but some of them don't. So the student fills out that application and that information is only shared with the Community Foundation of Middle Tennessee, the scholarship committee, which is small. It's not shared with any of the funders or anyone outside of that small group, so it's safe. And they'll make sure the application only goes to scholarships that the students qualify for. So talking a little bit about best practices in advising these students, because these can be very sensitive, very delicate situations. And the bottom line is we want to build trust with these students. We want them to know that they're safe with us and that we're their ally and we're not here to judge them. So a good question to ask is who all is involved in the student's journey. And a lot of times that's going to be the whole family. So involving the family is really important. Building rapport with the family, making sure the parents fully understand everything about post-secondary. It's very different in the US from most countries. Talk about how early it is to file, how important it is to file taxes every year with the correct information. And starting this conversation early is really important with everybody, but it just happens quite often that we'll get a student who started high school thinking college wasn't an option for them as an undocumented student. So they didn't see a future in education. So they didn't take their education seriously. And then junior or senior year, they learn that college is an option, but they already have a very low GPA and not a great academic record. And at that point, it's really difficult to start that late trying to find scholarships and find them a good school match. So starting that conversation very early with the student and the parents, so that the parents are filing their taxes, as well as helping the student prioritize school even while they're at home. Very important. emphasizing how important their GPA is, because again, these students may depend more heavily on merit-based scholarships since they're not getting any federal or state aid. So their academic performance is really, it's important for everybody, but for these students, honestly, it just is more important. And encouraging your staff to all take this approach, to encouraging from a very early age, to spreading the message that college is possible for everybody. A little more about building the college going culture. Again, is starting early and engaging families, and try to include in the conversation all the time from beginning to end, speakers and guests that reflect the students' backgrounds as a part of all efforts to build a college and career readiness culture, making sure that students are seeing people who have been in these situations and are still successful. Trying to dispel the myth that only the smart and the rich ones get to go to college. That's entirely untrue. And talking about how the funding works from an early age, because again, that's going to stress the importance of GPA and academic performance, because scholarships can be competitive and they can be the make it or break it of a student going to college or going to the college they really want to. And talking about the long-term benefits and painting the bigger picture and helping the students see that. Helping undocumented students see all of their possibilities clearly, again, dispelling myths, including in the conversation from freshman year that it doesn't matter, your immigration status does not affect your ability to go to college. You can still go. And them learning that from a very early age is really important. And including this information when you're talking to the entire class, even if you're not sure if there's anyone that has DACA or is undocumented in that class, if we begin incorporating this information into every conversation, it gets normalized and those students feel like they belong and they feel like they have a place and they deserve a place among their peers, which they absolutely do. But they can often feel alienated, exposed, lonely, and they don't realize how many other students are in this similar situation. And they don't realize that we're all on their side and that we want to see them succeed. And it's really important. I'll go to a lot of schools and I'll only see the EL classes, and that is fantastic. I'm happy to meet with all the EL students. We can do presentations in English and Spanish, that's great. But it's really important to realize that a lot of DACA and undocumented students are not your EL students. They've been here since they were babies, toddlers. Some of them are more comfortable in English than they are Spanish. So including this information in English and Spanish is very important, and including it for all of your classes is very important, because if you're only sharing this information with EL students, you're missing a huge number of this population. If you do have a student that you've been working with for a while, or that you feel you have a great relationship with, and they're not disclosing personal information, really don't take that personally, because you're working against years and years and years of a need to protect themselves, of their parents saying, you can't share this information with anybody or we'll get in trouble. So don't take that personally. And also don't try to sugarcoat the information we're sharing with them. It is true that it's harder for these students. It's a more difficult process, and they're overcoming more barriers than a lot of their peers in order to go to college. And it's important that they have the correct information so that they can make the best choice for themselves. And it's important that they have all of the resources, all of the information, and all of it correctly done so that they can make their decision. So if you're looking for something to say, if you're not sure how exactly to navigate these conversations, these are just some great examples of things you can say. Some of these in your entire classroom, just casually, so that it feels normal, just spreading the message that college is possible for everyone, no matter your immigration status. Even if you cannot complete a FAFSA, you are still There's still lots of resources out there for you, lots of great examples. We're happy to help you begin the conversation, navigate the conversation. A few more examples here that you can include in your classroom to start normalizing the conversation. So some questions about if a student doesn't disclose. One thing, if you really strongly suspect that they are undocumented or that they have DACA, but they haven't told you that, a nice way to ask is about the FAFSA. Like, are you eligible to submit a FAFSA? Will you be able to submit a FAFSA? It doesn't feel accusing. It doesn't feel exposing. It's just a nice way to ask, but that may not be the best route. You may just need to give them all of the information from completing the FAFSA to, if you can't complete a FAFSA, here are some other options, and not asking them which group they belong to, just giving them all the information so that they can, so that they have all of the information and whatever pertains to them, they can keep that to themselves, but they have the information. And letting them know that, again, you're an ally, you want to see them succeed, and you want them to have all of the best resources and information to do that. Putting them in control of the conversation can help them feel a lot more comfortable and like they can share information with you. These are some more really great resources to stay up to date on policies, on scholarships available to these students, places where students share their stories nationwide, and you can, feel like feel connected to other young people in a similar situation to you. So just a few final thoughts. We always approach our students and everything we do, all of the work we do, with empathy, respect, and inclusivity, understanding how these students are feeling and approaching it without judgment, with trying to share in their feelings, respecting them and including all of them is going to get you so much further in conversations with them and building trust with them and making sure they're getting the best resources that they can. And always share accurate information. And I think it's really important to stay informed about tuition equity, or the fact that right now DACA and undocumented students are not a part of that. Calling or writing representatives of our state, of our country, who are voting on on issues like that, letting them know how you feel about it, why it's important to you, and sharing information with your colleagues, with your administrators, to make sure everyone knows what's going on, how it might affect your students, impact your students. And if you have any questions at all, if there's anything that I can support you with, provide you with, please do not hesitate to reach out to me, Lindley Stowe. I can do counselor and educator trainings, student appointments, FAFSA support and alternatives. Esperanza Romero is our Gear Up coordinator, and she can also support many of your efforts, especially for 9th and 10th graders. So please don't hesitate to reach out if there's any other information or support that we can provide you with.